In 82 AD, buried beneath the deafening chaos of Rome's Grand Arena, a 19-year-old tribal girl named Lyria stood trembling in a cell so dark she could barely see her own hands. Above her, a crowd the size of a small city erupted in celebration as the victorious gladiator delivered the final blow to the two men she had been captured with. Her cousins, the last living ties to the world she once knew. Overhead, 50,000 voices roared his name in triumph, unaware that the true horror of the day was only beginning below their feet. What awaited Lyria in the next few hours was part of Rome's most carefully masked tradition, a ritual so vicious and so deeply embedded in the empire's machinery that even Roman historians disagreed on whether it should ever be written down. This wasn't a rumor, nor a dramatized legend whispered by Rome's enemies. It was a sanctioned reward, one that transformed a victorious gladiator into someone granted almost limitless authority once the arena gates closed. Senators who later tried to erase the evidence failed to grasp how thoroughly the practice had spread across amphitheaters from Britain to Syria. And before we step into those rooms built with brutal purpose, hit like, because the truth behind what happened after the crowd left is far darker than anything Rome showed on the sand. And subscribe, because once you hear this story, ancient Rome will never look the same again. The Colosseum in the early 80s AD was not merely an entertainment structure or a monument built to impress foreign visitors. It was the empire's most calculated political instrument, a place where Rome demonstrated its absolute power through orchestrated violence and ritualized humiliation. Completed only a few years earlier, the amphitheater towered over the capital like a living symbol of dominance, large enough to swallow armies and engineered with such precision that even its underground corridors functioned like a well-oiled machine of control. The air inside the arena was always heavy with the metallic smell of blood, layers of sweat trapped between stone and sand, and the lingering musk of the wild animals dragged into combat. The floor, deceptively simple in appearance, was coated with sand not for beauty, but for practicality. Its sole purpose was to absorb the fluids of dying men and beasts so efficiently that the surface could be raked clean in a matter of minutes before the next spectacle began. Beneath that sandy expanse lay a sprawling network of corridors, animal cages, storage rooms, cells for prisoners, and staging areas for gladiators who knew that with every fight they either climbed one step closer to freedom or tumbled into a grave dug before the match even began. Here the machinery of Rome's entertainment industry merged seamlessly with its mechanisms of political intimidation. Gladiatorial games served far more than entertainment. They were religious performances dedicated to Rome's gods, displays of military discipline, and tools for governors and emperors to reinforce their authority over conquered provinces. When the general Septimus Vero returned from crushing the northern tribes 2 years earlier, he marched not only with plundered riches but with hundreds of captives, warriors, priests, clan leaders, and noblewomen who symbolized the spirit of resistance. These weren't anonymous villagers. They were daughters of chiefs, wives of warriors, keepers of traditions, women whose presence on the battlefield or in tribal rituals carried deep cultural weight. Rome didn't merely defeat their armies, it sought to smother the very identity of the people they came from. To the Romans, humiliating a conquered people wasn't an afterthought. It was policy, refined through centuries of expansion. Physical conquest was only the first step. The next phase was psychological devastation, breaking symbols of pride, corrupting rituals, and demonstrating that even the most honored members of a defeated community could be bent, displayed, or discarded at Rome's discretion. The women held in the underground cells represented a targeted message, one meant to ripple across entire regions. Resisting Rome was futile, and submission wasn't an option but a permanent state. Victorious gladiators, often celebrated like minor celebrities yet owned like livestock, became instruments in this process, turned into living reminders that Rome alone decided who held power and who was rendered powerless. Their rewards, while glorified on the surface, were rooted in the same system of domination that created the prisoners they were offered. For women like Lyria, captured during the suppression of her tribe, the depths beneath the Colosseum were more terrifying than any battlefield. She had been taken alongside 17 other women, each representing a family, lineage, or symbol that Rome wanted extinguished. They had once lived lives of purpose, some trained in herbal medicine, some entrusted with sacred rites, some betrothed to tribal warriors, and now they were herded through torchlit tunnels by guards who treated them as entries on a ledger. Rome's officials documented them with cold precision on wax tablets: height, age, tribal origin, distinguishing marks, and marital status. They were processed not as people but as spoils, catalogued so their fates could be allocated with bureaucratic ease. The gladiator who had just slain Lyria's cousins was among the Empire's most prized fighters, a man whose entire existence revolved around violence, spectacle, and survival. For him, the reward awaiting after the fight wasn't framed as cruelty. It was presented as tradition, a routine privilege that reflected Rome's logic. Those who conquer are entitled to the conquered. This was why the prisoners were kept beneath the arena rather than in distant barracks. They were part of the same ecosystem that fed the spectacles above, a reservoir of human lives Rome could use to demonstrate its supremacy not only on the arena floor, but also behind closed doors. The people cheering above had no idea that the brutality didn't end with the final blow. For many victims, the real suffering began only after the noise faded. The Colosseum was designed not simply to showcase Rome's strength, but to erase any hope among those it defeated. And for Lyria, standing in a cell that smelled of damp stone and old blood, the shadow of that machinery had only just begun to close around her. As the sun dipped lower over the Colosseum and the crowd settled after the main spectacle, a different kind of preparation unfolded beneath the arena. One the public never witnessed yet. One that had become so standardized that scribes recorded its details with the same detachment used for grain shipments and livestock counts. In the dim torchlight of the hypogeum, gladiators whose victories had thrilled the crowds were escorted to a series of chambers where officials, trainers, and arena administrators initiated the next phase of the ritual that Rome considered as ancient as warfare itself. Victors did not simply bask in glory. They were guided through a selection process where rewards were offered on bronze tablets, gold bonuses, amphorae of imported wine, a night in a proper bed, and the privilege Rome called the spoils of conquest, which permitted the choosing of one of the captive women held below. To Rome, this tradition symbolized the unbroken chain between battlefield triumph and personal gratification, a cultural logic that viewed conquered women not as individuals, but as proof that resistance had been crushed completely. For Lyria and the other women held with her, these preparations were felt not in official declarations, but in the cold practicality of the guards' movements. They entered the holding cell with buckets of water, not to replenish thirst, but to wash and ready the captives as if polishing objects for display. Torn garments were replaced with coarse tunics, hair was roughly combed through, and each woman was inspected with an expressionless precision that made it clear the attendants saw them not as human beings, but as items passing through a process. An older captive, a priestess whose once respected position meant nothing in Roman captivity, murmured warnings to the younger women, explaining in whispers that this ritual was not an anomaly, but a repeated pattern witnessed in every major arena across the empire. Some women were made to participate in mythological reenactments on the arena floor before being claimed. Others were sent directly to the chambers behind the lifts where their fates were sealed in silence. Above them, the crowd was restless, unaware that the interlude entertainment they were about to witness was directly tied to the suffering unfolding below. Officials arranged for the mock battle segment of the afternoon, a spectacle designed to humiliate captives by forcing them into staged scenarios that blended theater and cruelty. Wooden weapons were handed out not for combat intent, but for psychological degradation. Lyria was lifted to the arena floor with the other women through a mechanical platform engineered to launch fighters and animals into view with dramatic flair. As the sunlight blinded her eyes and the deafening noise of the crowd washed over her, she understood she was no longer just a captive. She was part of a performance meant to reinforce Rome's dominance before the spectators' very eyes. They were lined up as a herald shouted fabricated crimes, reducing their identities to caricatures meant to justify their humiliation. Yet the cruelty that day took an unexpected turn. Instead of being forced into immediate execution or paraded as trophies, the women were ordered to fight each other, a command designed not to test strength but to fracture solidarity and transform trauma into amusement. Lyria found herself staring into the eyes of another captive, a woman who had once been a healer in their village, someone she had known since childhood. The crowd demanded violence, hoping to witness betrayal among the defeated, But the women stood still, clinging to the last shred of resistance they could offer, a refusal to become Rome's spectacle. Their defiance lasted barely more than a minute, yet in that brief span they achieved something few captives ever managed. They made Rome hesitate. The hesitation lasted only moments before guards stormed the arena floor, striking the women with the flat of their blades and dragging them toward the subterranean chambers. But even as they were forced underground, bruised and exhausted, a strange tension gripped the officials. Rome's spectacle relied on obedience, by gladiators, by prisoners, by the rituals themselves, and the resistance the women displayed disrupted the carefully orchestrated flow. Inside the tunnels, scribes scrambled to record the event properly, adding notes that some captives had failed to perform, and marking two of them, Lyria and her companion, for private reassignment. What those bureaucratic words concealed was the darkest machinery of Rome's entertainment culture, a system where the victor's privileges intersected with the empire's desire to crush every symbol of resistance. For the gladiator who had slain Lyria's cousins earlier that afternoon, the bronze tablet listing his rewards was no surprise. He had seen similar lists after every major bout in his 14 years of fighting. But the name attached to the captive he was to receive, written in the clipped Latin used by scribes, carried none of her history, none of her identity, none of the grief that churned inside her. She was reduced to a line item, and as he walked toward the chamber where she was taken, he entered a system designed not only to reward him for violence, but to remind him that his temporary power existed only because Rome wanted it to. For Lyria, the descent into Rome's hidden tradition had begun the moment she stepped into the arena light, but the true horror waited in the chambers below, rooms constructed with stone, iron, and intention, where the Empire's appetite for dominance reached a level even the crowd above would never be allowed to witness. The moment Lyria and the other defiant captive were dragged underground, the tone of the hypogeum shifted from chaotic spectacle to something eerily procedural, as if every corridor and stone room had been built not merely for functionality, but to enforce a philosophy of domination that ran deeper than any single event. The tunnels beneath the arena were not improvisations added over time. They were designed from the very beginning to separate, categorize, and break human beings with a kind of bureaucratic precision that made cruelty feel like routine. Scribes sat at narrow wooden tables, recording transfers and updates with styluses pressed into wax tablets, noting which captives were reassigned, which were to be executed on the arena floor, and which were to be delivered to gladiators as part of their sanctioned privileges. Guards moved with the indifference of men who had performed the same actions countless times, their boots echoing against the stone in a rhythmic pattern that made the entire place feel like a machine swallowing and expelling human lives as part of its daily functioning. Lyria was taken into a small stone chamber, the kind that resembled a storage room more than a prison cell, except for the iron rings embedded in the walls and the heavy wooden door that could only be locked from the outside. A single oil lamp flickered on a ledge, casting shadows that seemed to pulse with every shift of the flame. She could hear faint sounds from adjoining rooms, muffled voices of gladiators, the metallic scrape of armor being removed, the soft sobbing of captives who had been separated moments earlier. Every noise reinforced the reality that she was now trapped inside a system far bigger and older than herself, a system that had absorbed tens of thousands before her and would absorb thousands more long after her fate was decided. Rome had perfected this method of dehumanization so thoroughly that even the architecture itself felt complicit, as though every stone had been placed with the intention of reminding those inside that hope was an illusion. The gladiator who approached her chamber had earned his reward through blood, as the bronze tablet had declared. Yet when he paused outside her door, a moment of uncertainty clouded his expression. He had fought so many battles that his life had become a blur of combat, scars, and the constant fear of being one mistake away from death. Yet this part of the ritual, this so-called privilege, always weighed on him in a way the fights never did. He knew that Rome expected obedience not only from the captives, but also from him. To decline the reward was to risk being labeled weak, un-Roman, or worse, sympathetic to the people he was trained to kill. Within the hierarchy of the gladiator barracks, reputation was everything, and compassion was a liability that could cost a man his career, his status, or his life. The empire demanded the victor embody absolute dominance, and the reward system was crafted to ensure he played his role without question. Inside the chamber, Lyria stood silent, her back pressed against the far wall, her breath uneven as she tried to decipher the expression of the man who entered. She saw the hardened lines on his face, the streaks of dried blood that still marked his skin, and the weariness in his eyes, a weariness that suggested he too was a prisoner of a different kind. There was a painful irony in the fact that both of them, standing in that small, suffocating room, were being crushed by the same system that claimed to elevate one while destroying the other. Rome's logic was simple. Power must always flow downward, and even those given temporary authority were ultimately bound by the empire's expectations, just as tightly as the shackles on the captive's wrists. For several long moments, neither spoke. The silence was not peaceful. It was thick with dread, shame, and the unspoken truth that Rome had engineered this interaction long before either of them were born. When he finally set his helmet aside and pressed his hands against his face, the gesture seemed to drain the last of Lyria's courage. She braced herself, not knowing what would come next, aware only that the laws of the Empire granted him absolute control in that moment. Yet the next words he spoke, halting, uncertain Latin mixed with fragments of her own language he had picked up from other captives, shattered the cold script Rome had written for them. He asked about her people, about the man the arena officials claimed she had watched die, about the traditions her tribe had kept alive before Rome tore them apart. The questions were small cracks in the wall of brutality that defined the Empire's relationship with the conquered, but they were cracks nonetheless. Their conversation stretched on in a way neither expected, flowing with the strange honesty that emerges when two people, both broken in different ways, find themselves trapped in a place where the usual rules of identity no longer apply. Lyria spoke of her village, of ceremonies once held at dawn by the river, of the herbs her mother used to treat wounds, of the songs the elders hummed during harvest. He spoke of his father dying in debt prison, of being sold into the ludus at 9, of killing to survive because the alternative was to be forgotten in an unmarked pit beyond the city walls. In that dim chamber, surrounded by the machinery of Rome's cruelty, two lives collided not as conqueror and conquered, but as remnants of histories the Empire had sought to erase. But the Empire did not tolerate deviations from its rituals for long. The guards who patrolled the corridor heard voices inside the chamber and assumed compliance. But the moment they walked on, the gladiator faced a decision that would echo far beyond that evening. He could follow Rome's script or defy it, knowing full well that defiance rarely went unnoticed. And as he stood from the bench and approached the door, calling for the guard not with entitlement but with urgency, he marked the beginning of a fracture in the system Rome had spent generations perfecting. The decision the gladiator made that evening, rejecting the captive under the pretext of illness, seemed at first like an insignificant disruption, a technical loophole exploited in a moment of moral conflict. Yet in the weeks that followed, it began to ripple through the rigid structure of Rome's entertainment hierarchy in ways no one inside the hypogeum could have predicted. The scribe who recorded the rejection marked it with a small notation, the sort used for rare exceptions, never imagining the entry would find its way into the hands of an arena administrator irritated by the sudden deviation from routine. When the report reached the ludus, the trainers responded with suspicion, whispering among themselves about whether this particular fighter had grown soft or had begun listening to the stories that captives whispered among the cells. Rumors spread quickly through the barracks where gladiators lived in tightly packed quarters, men whose lives were governed by discipline, fear, and the unspoken belief that mercy had no place in their world. For many of them, victory was the closest they could ever come to agency, and the idea of relinquishing a privilege granted by Rome seemed to challenge the hierarchy that kept them obedient. What began as whispers soon reached higher ears. A young trainee, related to a minor senator, refused his own reward during a later event, claiming that he had been moved by the example set by the veteran fighter who had turned away a captive rather than claim her. This act ignited outrage among the trainers responsible for enforcing proper Roman values in the guilds that supplied fighters to the arena. The trainee was beaten for what his mentor labeled insubordination, creating a scandal significant enough that the boy's family brought the matter to the Senate floor. Rome's governing body, already accustomed to heated debates over taxation and provincial unrest, now found itself confronting an issue it had never wished to acknowledge publicly: the practice of distributing captive women as rewards for arena victories, a practice long known but rarely named, tolerated precisely because it functioned in the shadows. The Senate was forced to address the subject not out of compassion but out of political necessity. Several governors had recently sent urgent reports from the provinces detailing rising unrest among newly conquered tribes, each citing Rome's treatment of their captured women as a rallying point for resistance movements. These governors warned that the empire's method of using humiliation as a tool of domination was beginning to backfire, fueling an anger that far outlasted the battles themselves. The Senate floor erupted into a conflict between hardline traditionalists, who insisted that Rome's strength had always depended on the complete subjugation of its enemies, and the more pragmatic senators who argued that the spectacle of public degradation no longer served Rome's interests and instead threatened long-term stability. Documents that survived, heavily sanitized and cautiously worded, described these arguments with phrases like questions of custom and unsuitable public practices, concealing behind euphemisms the raw truth of what was being debated. Yet even beneath the polished rhetoric, one reality pressed heavily upon the senators. The empire's greatest threat was never the defeated tribes, but the ideas that spread when Rome's brutality was displayed too openly. What happened in the arena that day, the brief defiance by the women and the unexpected mercy of the gladiator, had become fodder for provincial storytellers who turned the incident into symbolic resistance. The Senate realized that continuing the public distribution of women during games risked creating martyrs rather than examples of Roman supremacy. The question was not whether the practice was morally defensible. Few senators entertained such concerns, but whether its visibility weakened Rome's ability to govern populations that were already restless under taxation, cultural erasure, and military presence. On the first day of October, after hours of argument and political maneuvering, the Senate passed what would later be known as the Law of Captive Women, a decree that prohibited the distribution of female prisoners as public rewards in the arena. The law did not abolish the underlying exploitation that permeated Rome's system, nor did it free the captives already held in the labyrinth beneath the amphitheater, but it did remove one of the most visible expressions of that cruelty. Arena officials were instructed to redesign segments of the games, eliminating public humiliation rituals involving captive women while quietly maintaining the private systems they had always used. Compliance varied across the empire, with some amphitheaters observing the decree and others inventing creative loopholes that preserved the spectacle while technically aligning with the law's wording. Rome had not reformed itself out of compassion, but out of survival instinct, adjusting the facade of civilization while keeping its darker machinery intact. For the gladiator whose moment of defiance had unwittingly triggered these changes, the consequences were complex. He fought several more matches in the following months, each victory bringing him closer to the wooden sword that symbolized freedom. His acts of refusal became whispers that circulated among fighters and slaves alike, though rarely spoken aloud in the presence of trainers. When he finally earned his liberation after a string of decisive victories, his first act as a free man was to purchase the freedom of the other woman who had stood beside Lyria in the arena that day. The administrative record mentions only her name, preserved in brittle ink on a faded fragment, but the context makes clear the significance of the gesture. It was a small rebellion in a world that rewarded obedience, a single flicker of humanity in a system built to extinguish it. Centuries later, long after the shouts of 50,000 spectators faded into dust and the empire that had once dominated continents fractured into memory, the truth of what happened beneath the Colosseum resurfaced not through heroic epics or grand monuments, but through fragments discovered by archaeologists who sifted through chambers Rome never intended future generations to see. When a team from the University of Rome excavated a forgotten section of the eastern hypogeum, they expected to uncover structural reinforcements or animal pens, the kinds of mundane details that usually emerged from such digs. Instead, they unearthed a cluster of rooms that bore striking evidence of having been designed for prolonged confinement. Small cells with iron rings embedded into the stone walls, drainage grooves cut into the floors that suggested deliberate planning, and shallow depressions where makeshift bedding had been pressed down over years of weight. Each detail aligned uncannily with the sanitized Senate records, and the scattered references found in writers like Cassius Dio, who hinted at allocation chambers for conquered women, but avoided explicit descriptions, as though even he found the truth too grotesque to write openly. Among the most disturbing discoveries were the scratches etched into the stone by hands that had tried desperately to leave some trace of their existence before fading into the machinery of Rome's erasure. Some scratches formed faint lines resembling tally marks, others resembled symbols or letters from unfamiliar tribal scripts, but all carried the same message. Someone had been here, someone Rome never meant to be remembered. Nearby, archaeologists found half a dozen bronze tags stamped with the word captiva, and dated between 79 and 82 AD, the exact years of the northern suppression from which Lyria and the other women had been taken. These tags were once used by officials to track prisoners the way merchants tracked inventory, reducing human lives to administrative units that could be allocated, transferred, or disposed of as the arena required. The pieces fit together with chilling precision, corroborating accounts that Rome did everything in its power to obscure. Yet the tragedy of this discovery lies not in the existence of the chambers themselves, but in what they reveal about the empire's philosophical core. Rome was not unique in its capacity for cruelty. Every ancient civilization committed acts of violence that modern audiences find difficult to comprehend. But Rome distinguished itself by institutionalizing brutality, shaping it into ritual, standardizing it with paperwork, and embedding it into architectural designs that still stand today as tourist attractions. The same civilization that engineered aqueducts capable of carrying water hundreds of miles also built subterranean rooms where people like Lyria disappeared without so much as a recorded sentence. This duality is what makes Rome both awe-inspiring and morally terrifying. Its brilliance and its emptiness coexisted so naturally that even senators who questioned certain customs never truly confronted the system itself, only the public optics surrounding it. For the gladiator who had spared Lyria from one fate only to lose her to another, the system offered no closure, no recognition, no reward. He died years later in obscurity, a freedman who wandered the outskirts of Rome living on odd jobs, remembered by no chronicler except for the administrative notes that marked the moment he disrupted the gladiatorial reward cycle. And for Lyria, whose death came in a cramped medical cell due to an infection Rome considered too trivial to treat, history offered no monument, no inscription, no honored grave. Her name survived only because of the fragmentary tags and the scattered mentions buried within bureaucratic documents, fragile threads that managed to endure long enough for modern scholars to piece them back together. The greater tragedy is not that individuals like Lyria were lost, but that Rome designed a system in which such loss was invisible, normalized, and ceremonialized. The screams that echoed through the subterranean chambers were absorbed into stone, overshadowed by the cheers above, and ultimately folded into the myth of Roman greatness without ever being acknowledged. The empire used tradition as a shield, insisting that its customs were justified because they had always existed, allowing brutality to be passed from one generation to the next, until no one questioned where ritual ended and morality began. And when we walk through the Colosseum today, marveling at its engineering and grandeur, few realize that beneath their feet lie the remnants of a world where humanity was stripped away with the same efficiency that Rome applied to building roads or training legions. Stories like Lyria's remind us that civilizations do not fall only when armies breach their walls. They fall when they lose their capacity for empathy, when cruelty becomes entertainment, and when people become instruments of systems they never chose. Rome perfected this transformation, and its ruins stand as a testament to how far a society can drift when power is allowed to shape morality unchecked. If the tale unsettled you, then let it do what history is meant to do. Force us to confront the darkness beneath the monuments. And if you believe these truths matter more than the myths we prefer, hit like, subscribe, and join me as we uncover the past Rome tried hardest to hide.